Hello and welcome to Media Monitor on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. Now this is where we take a look inside the world of media, analysing the trends, the issues and the reporting of some of the week's top stories. I'm Peter Ndoro. This is what's coming up on the show today. We'll be taking a look at the 30th anniversary of the unbanning of political parties in South Africa. That very significant speech by FW De Klerk on this day in 1990. And we go back to that time with some journalists that helped tell the story at the time. Then we explore a report that takes a look at a risk assessment of the South African media market, and that's by Global Disinformation Index. And in one of our regular features, we hear from our international editor today, who's coming from West Africa, in Ghana in particular, and I'll be taking a look at what's making the front pages there. So that's the show, but remember you can engage with us on social media using hashtag SABC Media Monitor, hashtag SABC Media Monitor. Before we get into those highlighted stories on the program though, let's first take a look at what's on the front pages of your Sunday newspapers today. Let me start with the Sunday Times lead story, and that's of Transnet CEO Portia Derby, who's vowing to clean up the rot at the SOE, and said that she wouldn't stand in the way of any investigation involving her ex-husband Brian Molefe, who was CEO of Transnet at one time. The City Press headline story is about the public protector, Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane, who says that she'll be taking legal action against what she believes is the unconstitutional probe by Parliament into her fitness to hold office. She's heading to the courts to have the process stopped. The Sunday Independent is running a story of government mulling over the repatriation of wives and children of terrorists who died in Syria. The women left the country to be with their husbands who had joined Islamic State in Iraq and Levant, ISIL, also known as ISIS. Now, the terror group, amongst other things, was involved in suicide bombings and car bombs. The Weekend Argus on Sunday is running a similar story to the Sunday Independent. 20 widows of former ISIS members wanting to come home, saying that they aren't coming back to plant bombs. The paper says that former ambassador to Syria, Mohammed Dangor, apparently is championing the repatriation. The paper also says that an official from Durko believes that these women will be South Africa's worst nightmare if they're allowed to come home. And the Sunday Tribune, again, running with the same story. These ISIS widows wanting to come home, but concerns about our safety if they do. And they said that they're not here to hurt anyone. And the Sunday World, well, that has former President Jacob Zuma on its front page, carrying a story where the paper says that Zuma has thrown out one of his wives, Thobeka Madiba Zuma. She allegedly took Mr. Zuma's confidential SIM cards, and after a family meeting, it was decided she had to go. All right, so that's the front pages of the print media. Let's take a look at what's captured your attention on social media on the platform Twitter. And this was the situation a short while ago, the top trends, and some of those we see every week. The Sacred Space, of course, on Radio Metro, Sunday Thoughts, all talking about motivation, as well as number 5. But number 4 is really what we're going to be focusing on today, and that takes us back to 1990 when FW De Klerk made his State of the Nation address, and towards the end he announced that political parties would be unbanned and that in a few days' time Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners would be freed. So that's what's doing the rounds on Twitter, and I've got to tell you that people have had mixed reactions. Was he forced into releasing Mandela and unbanning political parties? Was he a good guy? Was he a bad guy? Everyone is having their say on social media today. And unfortunately as well, what happens, and I'll show you just now again, same theme about the role De Klerk played on this day, and perhaps setting up the democracy we then got to enjoy from 1994. But also under De Klerk, of course, is FW De Klerk, the rugby player. And so he's mixed up in all of this, and the whole thing is his hairstyle. It's trending for some reason. So yeah, De Klerk, FW and FAF, big trends today on social media. All right, now there's so much to get through on the show this morning, and helping us make sense of these stories are our guest editors. And we're very pleased to be joined by veteran journalist and former editor of the Sunday Times and City Press, Matata Tsedu, and SABC foreign editor, Sophie Mkwena. To both of you, a very good morning. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning, Peter and the viewers.
We look forward to chatting about so much today. Okay. All right, now today marks 30 years since President FW De Klerk announced political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela, would be released. That a ban on a number of political organizations would be rescinded, notably the African National Congress, Pan-Africanist Congress, as well as the South African Communist Party. Now, this would prove to be a pivotal moment in South Africa's political landscape and would pave the way for democracy. Now, many journalists watched the story unfold, and one of them was the founding editor of the Weekly Mail that was banned at the time. Now adjunct professor of journalism at Wits University, I'm now joined by Anton Harber, who talks to us via Skype. Prof, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. Good to have you on the program again. So let's go back to that time. All right, let's go back to that time. What do you remember about that day?
There had been rumors.
All right, Prof, you know what? We're struggling to hear you. We're struggling to hear you. So what we're going to do, I'm going to ask that our team try and redial you, and hopefully we can come back to you in 5 minutes' time. But in the meantime, let's take a quick break, because I really want to hear from Anton Harber. He founded the Weekly Mail. He was the founding editor, so reporting quite a bit about those stories, and himself, his paper banned at one stage as well. So let's see if we can't try and get him again right after the break. Stay with us. Right, welcome back. You're watching Media Monitor, and today we're focusing our attention on an event that took place 30 years ago today. The then President, FW De Klerk, delivered his State of the Nation address, and towards the end of his speech, he announced the unbanning of a number of political organizations, and also that political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela, would soon be released. And one man who was a journalist at the time is Anton Harber, who's an adjunct professor of journalism at Wits University, and he joins us on the line now to tell us what he remembers of that time. Prof, thanks so much for joining us. Take us back to 1990 and what you remember about that day.
Well, I think the main thing was just how surprised we all were at how far FW De Klerk went. You know, there'd been talk of partial reforms and partial action and conditional release for some years. And there'd been rumors that discussions were taking place with Mandela and with the ANC behind the scenes. But to see suddenly out of the blue for him to announce the freeing of the political prisoners and the unbanning of political organizations, not just the ANC, but the PAC and the SACP and a number of others. We really had to sit up and take notice that he appeared for the first time to be serious about political change.
All right, and I would imagine that reaction must have been extreme, particularly with nationalist and right-wing white people at the time.
Well, certainly. There was a real danger of a right-wing backlash, and the right-wing behaved very negatively. I think most of us were torn between wanting to celebrate this extraordinary moment that we'd been waiting for so long, and doubts about his sincerity and concern about how it would be played out and whether we could trust FW De Klerk and the National Party to carry through on what they were saying.
All right. So as a journalist, you said that a lot of it was a lot of rumors that were floating around. How much did you know about some of the talks that were taking place inside and outside the country?
Well, I'll tell you of two incidents that kind of sum it up. Terry Lakota, who was then an inside UDF leader, had a bet with me. He said to me, this was 6 months earlier, before the release of Mandela. He said, I'll bet you a bottle of whiskey that Mandela's out within a year.
Wow.
And I said, you're a fantasist, you're being ridiculously optimistic. Sure, I'll have the bet. It's an easy win. And of course, he knew more than I did, and he proved me wrong, and it was the happiest bet I've ever lost and paid up.
Wow.
I'll tell you another story, is that about a year before that, we had reported on secret discussions between Mandela and Kubi Kutsia, the Minister of Justice, taking place in prison. And the ANC denied it strongly, and Thabo Mbeki, in exile, stood up in New York at a press gathering and said we were being taken for a ride, we were believing the propaganda of the regime. So we were really shocked because we certainly had some evidence that it was happening, but even the ANC was denying it.
Wow. How difficult was it to be a journalist at that time? I mean, I know that the Weekly Mail had gone through lots of challenges with the regime, being banned at one stage.
Yes, so we'd been banned. We were publishing at the time of the release. We faced many charges for contravening the emergency and censorship regulations. And then suddenly all of that disappeared. And frankly, we were like deer caught in the headlights, because we'd had a certain attitude and approach and style of journalism that came from an era of censorship and repression and fighting apartheid, and we had to relearn a new kind of journalism appropriate over time to what was to become a new democracy.
So was there, I don't know, a change in the laws, or you just realized that you were free to report, or what was the change? What was the shift? And was it almost immediate?
The formal change in the laws took a while. But what happened is we woke up one morning and we suddenly realized that none of those laws had any effect, that we could actually for a while just do what we wanted. So this was entirely new and different for us, and in many ways we had to relearn the basics of journalism, because of journalism in a democracy is different from journalism under censorship and repression.
And then the reporting of the story itself, were you able to explain to people what it meant, and did it mean that democracy was on its way? I suppose you still had to try and make sense of things.
We did have to try and make sense of things, but I must admit we were skeptical, and I think rightfully so. We had to ask ourselves whether FW De Klerk and the National Party would see through what they were promised. And we did see a long period in which they acted covertly and overtly to undermine their opposition. You might recall it was a big moment when we exposed, a year later, what became known as Inkatha, secret government support for the IFP, for Inkatha, to try and build them up to counter the ANC. And so we really had to take on a lot of the covert attempts by the state and elements of the state to undermine the movement towards democracy.
And how did De Klerk start to explain what he had done in the coming days?
Well, he presented it as an act of great statesmanship. The truth is that the economy was in collapse. The country had become ungovernable. There was an uprising that had spread and was continuing to spread across the country, and that he was put in a position where either we were headed for a terrible brutal civil war, which probably no one could win, but which the regime would eventually have to lose, or taking such bold steps to change the political landscape. And I think we're obviously very grateful that he had the courage to take those bold steps.
Okay, and the political organizations that were now unbanned, what was coming out of them now that they were able to speak?
Frankly, I remember us trying to speak to the ANC and saying, how do you read it? Are you coming home? What are you doing? And quite frankly, they were as bewildered as everyone. There was a huge debate going on in Lusaka about how they should handle this, about whether they should accept the government's bona fides and come home. What they did, in fact, was they started to send some people home to test the waters and to start setting things up in place for the ANC to come home and for others, the SACP, the PAC, all of them, to come home and to start a process of negotiations. But there was grave doubt and uncertainty because we were all taken so much by surprise.
All right, so 30 years on, every time at this time of the year, there's a debate about De Klerk's legacy and his role on the path to democracy. With hindsight, we can put it all together, and I'm just wondering, as a journalist who's been watching the story unfold, how do we remember De Klerk's role and his contribution, in inverted commas, at that time, leading us to democracy?
Look, his legacy is a very mixed one. We have to remember that the speech led to a period of very bad violence, and what emerged was increasing evidence that his security forces and people in the state were at least partly responsible for that violence. So while he turned his back on a lifelong of being a conservative apartheid supporter, to this bold speech and this bold move, he did a lot in the next 2 years to undermine his reputation by failing to stop those around him and those within the state and those within the security forces from being involved in the terrible violence of that period. And it's easy to forget how brutal and horrible, how many people died in the violence in which security forces were involved.
Professor Anton Harber, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed for your thoughts and insights about that very difficult period in our country's history. All right, let's go into our news archives now and take you back to February the 2nd, 1990, and that landmark speech by the then President FW De Klerk. It was his State of the Nation address at the opening of South Africa's Parliament. And towards the end of this address, he surprised many South Africans when he announced Nelson Mandela would soon be a free man and a number of political organizations would be unbanned. This is how the SABC covered the story.
State President, Mr. FW De Klerk, opened Parliament today with what's being described as a watershed speech in South African politics. The address and the news it contained has been welcomed worldwide, but here at home, right-wing groups have expressed their dissatisfaction. President De Klerk's announcements included the unbanning of the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress and the South African Communist Party, the return of all exiles, the release of all prisoners jailed for their membership of restricted organizations, the suspension of restrictions on 33 internal radical organizations ranging from COSATU to the Blanke Bevrydingsbeweging, the lifting of most of the provisions of the state of emergency, including restrictions on the media, the lifting of restrictions on 374 people, and the assurance that Mr. Nelson Mandela will be released as soon as possible. This report from our political staff.
What Mr. De Klerk has been saying for several months, that there was no place for an old South Africa and that the government was moving towards a new South Africa, today became a reality. The state president stunned parliamentarians and these normally vociferous detractors with wide-ranging announcements. The focus fell on negotiations and the scrapping of barriers on the course to talking to one another.
The steps that have been decided are the following. the prohibition of the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the South African Communist Party, and a number of subsidiary organizations is being rescinded. People serving prison sentences merely because they were members of one of these organizations, or because they committed another offense which was merely an offense because a prohibition of one of the organizations was in force, will be identified and released. Prisoners who have been sentenced for other offenses such as murder, terrorism, and arson are not affected by this. The media emergency regulations as well as the education emergency regulations are being abolished in their entirety.
All right, so that was FW De Klerk on this day in 1990. Well, let's get another take on this significant moment in history that unfolded back then, and we'll get a sense from someone who was a journalist at the time and somebody who was young and living in the rural areas and how they absorbed that information. Let me start with you, Matata Zedu, because you were working as a journalist, and we've just heard from Anton Harbour, and he says there were rumours circulating before the announcement. How much did you know at that stage of what was going to happen next?
It became quite clear the year before when the other prisoners were released, Sisulu, Mbeki, Govan. So it became quite clear that there was a testing of the waters that was being done by the regime to see what would happen if these terrorists were to be unleashed on South Africa. And well, nothing happened except a lot of celebrations. I remember a lot of school kids in Soweto didn't want to go to school. They were camping outside Sisulu's house, and he came out and he said, "What are you doing here? Go to school. I don't need to be guarded. I've spent my entire life being guarded in prison." So it became quite clear. Even Mandela's removal from Robben Island to Victor Verster was an indication. There was all these stories flying around about discussions that were taking place. I remember at one stage I interviewed Thabo Mbeki in Harare. This would have been around 88 or 89. And I said, "What are the big challenges going forward?" And he said to me, "Our people at home must start preparing for the return of the leaders." I said, "Are you coming back home?" He said, "I'm just telling you that people at home must start preparing for the return of the leaders." So it was quite clear that something was afoot. But on the day when De Klerk then made all these announcements, this was in the middle of a country that had become totally ungovernable. He was in office, but not necessarily in charge of the country. And so it wasn't a big surprise that he had opted to go this route in order to stem the tide of the violence and demonstrations that had covered virtually the entirety of South Africa.
Wow. And Sophie, what I'm interested in with you in particular is that many people were living in the rural areas, and you were young at the time. How much information did you have access to about these big events that were taking place?
At that time, I was in the Val Triangle. I was working in the Val Triangle already. But as a child who came from the countryside, I would go home often. And you'll find that in the countryside, people didn't have information because, you know, the South African Broadcasting Corporation then was an institution that would side with the regime, and therefore little was known, and they would only communicate what they wanted to communicate. So we're just going with the wave. But in the Val Triangle at that time, I was an activist as a civil society person, the civic movement, and we were part of the people who were trying to ensure that something is happening on the ground in terms of information, to get the proper information. But I remember Lord McCammell, who was the leader then, couldn't even have proper information to communicate to us. But also remember at that time in the Val Triangle, it was doom and gloom. People were dying every day. You would sleep and you would wake up the next day and you'll hear that information that so many people have been killed in such and such a area and in this street. And therefore it was doom and gloom and we couldn't really make sense of what was happening. But I also want to agree with Matata that people like Matata and some of the senior leadership were already looking at this possibility, and because the regime had collapsed, truth be told, and the country was completely isolated, and the sanctions had taken its toll on South Africa, and therefore the economy had collapsed, and he had no choice. It was not a voluntary action.
All right, so Matata, I spoke to Anton before. I mean, if it was difficult being a white journalist at the time, it was probably 10 times worse being a black journalist. Take us through just how hard it was to tell these stories.
You lived in the middle of the suppression, so you knew what was happening. But, for example, one of the last lines of De Klerk's speech was that all the emergency regulations relating to media restrictions are rescinded forthwith. Now, that was critical because at that time, you couldn't write any story that said anything about the army or the police without that story being vetted by the Bureau of State Security. They called it the Bureau of Information, but essentially they were a censoring board that sat in Pretoria. You had to send your story there, and they would tell you, no, you can't say this, you can't say that. So I remember one story where soldiers had gone into an area near Teflop, near the university, and beaten up villagers. And I came here with to Joburg with my story to write it here. And when I had written it, Tami Mazwai, who was my news editor, then gave me a car to drive to town, to the lawyer's office with my copy. And I sat there with my lawyer, and he started saying, you can't say this, you can't say this. And of, let's say, 10 paragraphs, I remained with 2.
Wow.
And I said, no, I can't publish that. So you had to find ways of telling the story because the story needed to be told. So my way was to remove any reference to soldiers. So I would just say white men who were dressed in khaki uniforms and carrying long guns were seen in the village terrorizing these people. And because I didn't say they were soldiers, I didn't have to go through the bureau, and I knew that my readers knew who I was talking about.
Did everything change for you as a journalist after that speech?
Yeah, it did, because suddenly you could call Tom Sabina in Lusaka and quote him verbatim. Before that, I mean, Tony had got into trouble for interviewing Oliver Tambo and running the interview in the Cape Times, and he even, I think, he got fired for that. You know, so after this, as Anton was saying, you sort of like you're geared towards this resistance mode in terms of your writing. And then suddenly it's actually okay. Yeah, and so there had to be an adjustment period around how you were writing the stories now.
And Sophie, did things start to become? Was information starting to flow much more after that?
Yes, we were able to get information, as Matata has indicated, and also we would take newspapers to the countryside, particularly to share with our parents, our relatives, and the communities there, because you couldn't really rely on the radio stations, because you are fully aware that there was some censorship, as Matata has indicated. If it was a problem for private media, what about an institution that was run by the then government? Therefore, the information and the news, then you got snippets, but clearly it wasn't really something that you can really trust. But later it became much better, and the newspapers played an important role in ensuring that we get a better sense of what was happening. But in the countryside, people rely on broadcasting.
All right, and just to wrap up this little section, Matata, there was a lot of distrust about the government, De Klerk, and this is 1990. 4 years we were going to see democracy come into play. Did it matter whether you didn't trust him or not at that stage, or it was obvious what was happening next?
No, it was important that he wasn't trusted, because on the ground, as Anton was indicating, up here, De Klerk was this man of honor who had released Mandela, unbanned all these organizations, is bringing democracy. But below, his system was systematically attacking everybody who would be standing in the way of the National Party, ensuring that the economic power, for example, stays the same. And so you had all the third force problem, people being killed in trains, all those killers sponsored by the same De Klerk. So he had to be not trusted continuously. And for the ANC, it was even a big problem. But at what point do you dismantle MK and your structures? What if this guy, as you can see, really turns around? What is your fallback position? And it really took Mandela to just bulldoze through all those problems.
Wow.
And you'd recall the Bushbato massacre, the Mofokeng massacre. So I think I agree with Matata that much as you'd celebrate the little changes and the breather, but on the ground it was business as usual, if not worse.
All right. We'll leave this for the time being, but lots still to discuss. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll have more for you on Media Monitor. Stay with us.
We believe that the fourth industrial revolution can change things for us.
We can do telemedicine. Now that means that over a long distance or any distance, I don't have to go and visit a doctor. I can actually see the doctor online.
In Africa, we don't have sufficient doctors. In Africa, we don't have sufficient clinics. It actually makes sense.
Wi-Fi and 5G technology formed some part of the conversation that took place right here.
5G, of course, has the advantage of better experience and also the high efficiency when it comes to the cost per bit.
We haven't issued spectrum in the last 10 years. We have 4G today, which we have had to harvest spectrum from other technologies to be able to get 4G, and now it's costing us a lot more money.
Many, if not most, small medium enterprise businesses are making technology their own businesses.
On Network every Sunday at 8:30 p.m.
Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Now, the internet, without doubt, has changed so much about how we live our lives, both online and offline. It's altered the way that news is funded, produced, consumed, and shared. And this is according to a study by the Global Disinformation Index titled Risk Assessment South African Media Market. Well, to tell us a little bit more about what's in the report and what it means, I'm now joined via Skype by Craig Fagan from the Global Disinformation Index. So Craig, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. We understand that you've just published this 2020 risk assessment report focusing on South African media market. Why South Africa?
Well, first, thank you, Peter, for having us and bringing this issue up in the public discussion. So one of the reasons we looked at South Africa as part of the inaugural study of markets, we also did the United Kingdom, is that both countries, South Africa has a very strong tradition of media, and media independence has been an important force, especially looking in the last 30 years. And if you look at also the changes in the last 30 years, there's also been a lot of issues with increased people getting their news through the internet. 90% of South Africans who read the news get it through online news. And at the same time, you're getting a rise in disinformation problems. Around the recent elections you saw in South Africa last year in May, there was a lot of stories that needed to be debunked. Even now with the coronavirus, we see things spreading in South Africa and other countries. And so this is one of the reasons why we wanted to understand a little bit better for a market that has a strong media and readership. What does it mean to understand the risks of disinformation being spread through sources that people use every day?
All right. I think you've given us a clue about some of the findings now in that answer. But take us through the main points of what you found.
Well, one of the things that we found is that we were looking at a series of different risk levels. So we were trying to understand not just one issue that would create a disinformation problem. So, for example, a lot of people talk these days about clickbait, headlines that are pretty outrageous that get us to click. And this is about trying to get our eyeballs, our dollars from ads being served up on the sites we go to. But there's also a problem with other challenges, such as, are articles negatively targeting specific groups within a country, whether it's the political leaders or parties, or is it about different ethnic or social groups in a country? Is it also looking at editorial guidelines? So are there the right checks and balances to make sure that the newsroom can be trusted? And the final thing is understanding how do people that are media experts in the country over time view these different sites as being a brand that we can trust? And these three different elements, these three different pillars are what we looked at in a variety of flags or different indicators under each one. And when you look at together, you get a snapshot of what's happening across the market. And we had sites in South Africa that scored very well in a minimal risk category, and some that scored, as you can see in our report that's available on our website, some that scored very low, that were at a maximum risk. But the majority of the market fell within a middle range, meaning that there was a mixture of challenges that should be addressed. And one of those things that can be fixed very easily is we saw that very few newsrooms that are online publish a statement of editorial independence. And this is just to help readership know very easily when they go to the site that the articles are reading, that the editorial team that selected them, that has edited them, that has served them up, that are independent from ownership or any other sort of influence.
And how would you assess our risk compared to other countries?
Well, as I said, Peter, this was the first time we put this methodology out. We spent a lot of time developing it. We worked with an international technical advisory group that helped us come up with these different flags that we need to put together to understand what is the risk a site can carry disinformation. And again, even if you look at the site on its score, the score doesn't mean that it's a disinformation site or it's not. It just tells you what the risk level is. Just as if you were looking at, let's say, a company to invest in or a market that you wanted to open a business in, you want to look at all the indicators and you take that as a whole. So in the same case, we did that for South Africa and the UK. This is the first time we did the study. And so as we build it out, we're going to do another 8 countries this year at least. We'll be able to compare better across countries, across this universal set of flags that we selected.
All right. And what do media houses do once they get a sense of this risk assessment? Is it tightening things up? Is it what's the action that needs to be taken?
Well, we see this, Peter, as helping open up a positive dialogue about the challenges that any media market faces. And as I said, we also did this in the United Kingdom. We reached out to all the newsrooms that we assessed at the beginning and also with their individual scores. So for now, both in the UK and South Africa, we have opted not to publish the individual site scores. But in the next 6 months, we will, after consulting with the newsrooms, have a chance to update any scores if they choose to help us update them, and then publish them. One of the things that I've talked with some major news sites in South Africa already is that they recognize that some of their editorial checks and balances could be better. This point about just having a statement about, of editorial independence of the site. Putting up policies, one problem, as you might know, as being in news, is this idea of deep fakes, right? That algorithms, artificial intelligence are generating news. And if a site is using that, it's important that readers know that. And if they're not, they should just have a statement that they're not using any artificially generated content. And that's something that we found across the board was missing on South African sites. And it's a new challenge that needs to be addressed. And that's something that is very important. And the other issue is corrections policy. We found that for the most part, there aren't corrections policies online for the sites that we surveyed, some of the top 30 sites in South Africa. So these are different things. Having a corrections policy, so you know if there's a problem and a reader writes and calls out the issue, that it's very clear that what the mediation steps can be taken to fix it. And I think, we've had some really positive engagements with newsrooms in South Africa, and we hope to continue as we discuss what can be done, particularly around these operational checks and balances.
I would imagine, Craig, that in the end, why it's so important now is that we are online, and therefore the risk is multiplied because it can be distributed faster and more widely. Because the idea that papers churn out propaganda and so on and so forth, that's been the case since the beginning of time.
No, indeed, Peter, and you hit the nail right on the head, so to speak. The issue is that we see that as more people get online in South Africa and in other countries, more people are getting introduced and their main news is coming through online, whether it's WhatsApp or other platforms that they're accessing or the news sites themselves. And we also see that more people are distrusting the news they read. So figures from South Africa show that were done by a research institute, the digital news reports done by the Reuters Institute in the UK showed that over 70% of South Africans are not able to tell the difference between fake and real news, and that over 40% fear that they're being exposed to fake news. And then you add that to the fact of what that news means in terms of how we form our societies, how we vote, how we think about our neighbors, how we think about our politicians. Having trusted news sources is a foundational part of our societies. And you're right that this has always been a challenge in any market, but as now news is spread so fast, articles are disconnected from the sites that they originate on. If we don't have a trust in the sites that are producing these and the articles themselves, then it really creates a crisis of confidence in a key pillar of our institutions, our media.
All right, Craig, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks so much indeed for giving us some insights about this index, this report, and they can find it on your website. What's the address again?
www.disinformationindex.org. So please, you can download the report as well as the report on UK and our methodology. And just one thing to say, Peter, is one of the things that we see is happening is that actors that are in it for the clicks to get money from advertising need to have their advertising pooled. And this disinformation risk rating gives advertisers in South Africa and other countries more information to better place their ad spend, so it goes to trusted sites like SABC and others. So thank you.
All right, thanks very much indeed, Craig. All right, very quick comments from both of you. I mean, the risk, you've been journalists for a long time and you've seen the changes over time. Do you feel more vulnerable now as media outlets than ever before?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite obvious. I mean, the digital revolution has brought a lot of advantages, but there are also drawbacks, as in anyone can become a publisher, and once you've put it out there, people are going to pick it up, retweet, do this, and within a few minutes, something that has not been verified by anyone, it's flying around pretending to be the ultimate truth. So the big challenge, as far as I see it, for our audiences here in South Africa, it's around the sophistication of understanding this medium. And my rule is, if it sounds or smells outlandish,
it is.
Check.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And Sophie, I guess as a public broadcaster, we have to be more than ever the trusted outlet.
Yes, and as Matata has indicated, it has also brought pressure on us because the more you delay to come up with information, people think you are found wanting, you are not up to the task, and sometimes you end up making mistakes. But for an example, look at the coronavirus. I mean, in normal instances, China would have been able to manage the information, but right now it's a free-for-all. I mean, people are sending messages using social media because of access to internet, and therefore it's very difficult to know the truth, or particularly to agree in terms of numbers of people who have died or who are infected.
All right. So we're going to leave that for the time being. We chat a bit more about that actually when we look at the papers in a short while. But we're going to take a quick break, and after that, we'll have more for your Media Monitor. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Media Monitor. Now, South African photographer Santu Mofokeng died on Sunday, aged at 63. Mofokeng was known for his iconic black and white pictures of African life in Johannesburg townships during the apartheid era. We're now joined by Ananas Leki Dao, who worked closely with him to tell us a little bit about what he remembers about Santu. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Our condolences. I would imagine for someone that you've known for so long, this is a sad time for you.
Yeah, it was painful to know that Santu left, and I quickly decided to come to support the family, his wife Watimelo, and the children, and also see what I know about Santu and tribute.
So where did you first meet him?
I first met Santu at the festival, Bamako Festival. That was the first edition, 1994.
Wow.
I was so young photographer, and Santu was there, and he got interested in me, and we kept in touch until he passed away. Yeah.
So, as a photographer, how would you describe the work that he did?
Wow. Santu is a legend in the photography, especially on this continent. I used to say he's my hero on this continent. His work is very relevant. It makes sense. And yes, Santu was not only the asset for South Africa, but also for the continent. He left a very important legacy about the story of South Africa, about even the Africa in terms of largest.
What would you say you learned from him yourself?
I learned from Santu his integrity, his intellectual honesty, and also something I like from Santu is outspoken. Santu say what he want to say, and whether you like or you don't like, but he thinks about how he will feel, and those things I was very interested in him, and I try to be like him. And also photographically he makes sense. He made sense, and his work is very, very, very powerful. Yeah.
It's interesting you talk about his contribution to the continent, and that you met in Bamako for the first time. How important was the continent for him beyond South Africa?
Say that again?
How important was Africa, the continent, for him?
For Santu?
Yeah.
Every time Santu did something, it was his continent. So yeah, he was very engaged with his continent, and also beyond the continent. When I saw his retrospective in Paris in the big museum, it was as an African. So Santu, everywhere Santu went, he was like an ambassador of Africa, and so. It was a pride for us, and for a young photographer like me, he was like an example, and how as an African and photographer we should show a very relevant and potent images of the continent.
Well, thank you very much indeed for sharing a few moments with us to talk about this.
I express also my condolences to the country. Like I say, Santu was an asset for this country. I don't know who's going to take his place, but I hope somebody will do that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll start wrapping things up. We'll have a quick look at the papers. Stay with us. right. In fact, sadly, this is where we're going to have to leave the program for this week. But just to say thanks once again to our journalists and our editors today. Matata Tsedu, thank you so much for taking us back to a very important period in our history that we should never forget, and appreciate what we have now. Thanks so much indeed for your insights. And Sophie, thanks so much. Always invaluable contributions on the program. Thanks so much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us as well.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, and you at home, thanks so much indeed for tuning in. Have a great week ahead, and we'll catch you next week, same time, for more of the same. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.